History often remembers the loudest people first, the generals on horseback, the speakers who could stir a restless crowd, the presidents whose portraits seemed to watch us from marble halls. But some lives move differently. Some people changed the world without ever appearing larger than life. James Madison was one of them. He was physically fragile, socially reserved, and rarely the most imposing man in any room. Yet when a young nation stood uncertain before its own future, this quiet thinker helped design the structure that would hold it together. If you enjoy stories where history feels personal, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many forgotten moments, still waiting to be brought back into the light. Before James Madison became known as one of the central minds behind the American Constitution, he was simply a boy growing up in colonial Virginia. Nothing about his appearance suggested that he would one day influence millions of lives. He was small, often sick, and frequently absent from the rough games enjoyed by other children. While stronger boys ran across fields and learned to command horses, James spent long hours indoors. His world was quieter, but it was not smaller. Books opened doors that his body could not. Virginia, in the middle of the 18th century, was a land of beauty, resting upon contradiction. Green hills rolled beneath wide skies. Rivers moved slowly through forests and farmland. Tobacco fields stretched across the countryside, promising wealth to powerful families. Visitors could easily be enchanted by the calm landscape, but beneath that calm surface stood a social order built on privilege and forced labor. Elegant plantation homes rose beside fields, worked by enslaved men, women, and children, whose names were rarely written into the official story. The Madison family belonged to the wealthy planter class. Their estate at Montpelier was large, productive, and respected. From the outside, it appeared secure. Land meant influence. Tobacco meant income. Family connections meant opportunity. James was born into advantages that most people around him would never know. Yet comfort did not protect him from uncertainty. Illness entered his childhood again and again. Fevers, weakness, and strange periods of exhaustion made his parents fear that his life might be brief. Even ordinary days could become tests of endurance. Medical science offered little certainty. Doctors could observe symptoms, but they often could not explain them. Treatments were sometimes more dangerous than the illness itself. For a child, sickness can make the world feel very small. The distance between one room and another may seem enormous. The sound of other children playing outside can feel like a reminder of everything the body refuses to do. James learned early that strength was not evenly given. Some people could trust their muscles. He would have to trust something else. His mind became the place where weakness could not easily follow him. Reading was first a refuge, then a discipline, and finally a way of life. Ancient history showed him republics, rising and falling. Philosophy introduced questions about justice, duty, freedom, and power. Religious texts revealed how belief could comfort people, divide them, or place authority beyond human reach. Each book seemed to whisper that the visible world was only one layer of reality. Behind every law stood an idea. Behind every empire stood a choice someone once believed was necessary. James did not read merely to collect facts. He examined arguments. He compared one civilization with another. He asked why certain governments survived, while others collapsed beneath corruption or ambition. The questions were far larger than his age. Why do people obey rulers who fail them? Why does freedom disappear so easily? Can power ever be strong without becoming dangerous? These thoughts were not yet political plans. They were only quiet seeds. But history often begins in this way. Not with a trumpet, but with a question no one can forget. His father understood that the boy possessed unusual concentration. Tutors were brought to the household, and James approached every lesson with remarkable seriousness. He studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, geography, philosophy, and religious thought. Many young gentlemen received similar instruction, but few treated learning with such urgency. James seemed aware that time could not be trusted. A healthy child may believe tomorrow will always arrive. A sickly child may learn to use today more carefully. Every completed book became a small victory over uncertainty. One of his teachers noticed that James rarely needed to be encouraged to study. The greater challenge was convincing him to stop. He could remain at a desk for hours, following a difficult argument until every piece fit together. While others admired quick intelligence, James developed something more durable. He developed patience. Brilliance can dazzle a room for a moment, but patience can rebuild a nation. Long before he entered politics, he was training himself to listen, compare, prepare, and wait until emotion had cooled enough for reason to speak. This discipline did not make him cold. Beneath the careful habits lived a sensitive young man who knew fear more intimately than many around him. He worried about his health. He wondered whether his life would have purpose. He sometimes experienced periods of deep discouragement, the kind that arrives when the future feels hidden behind a closed door. Yet these private struggles may have given him an unusual understanding of human limitation. He never expected people to behave perfectly. Later, this realism would become central to his political thinking. Outside Montpelier, another kind of uneasiness was spreading. The American colonies remained under British rule, but the relationship was beginning to change. Taxes, trade restrictions, and distant decisions created resentment. Merchants complained in taverns. Printers filled newspapers with arguments. Ministers spoke about conscience and liberty. Lawyers debated the ancient rights of English citizens. Most of these conversations appeared ordinary at first. Revolutions rarely announce themselves clearly. They begin as irritation, then become language, then slowly become a shared feeling that the old arrangement can no longer continue. James listened to these changes with the attention of someone accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. He was still young, still uncertain, and still largely confined to the world of family and study. He had not yet stood before a legislature. He had not yet helped design a government. He had not yet discovered the burden hidden inside great ideas. But the tension between authority and liberty was already entering his thoughts. The same boy who questioned ancient republics was beginning to observe the weaknesses of the world around him. There was another contradiction close to home, one that would follow him throughout his life. The language of liberty was growing louder, yet the plantation economy around him depended on slavery. James lived inside this moral conflict. He benefited from a system that denied freedom to others. Even as he became increasingly devoted to theories of natural rights and representative government, this tension cannot be removed from his story. It makes him more human, more difficult, and more revealing. People are often capable of seeing injustice clearly while remaining entangled in it. Perhaps that is why the story of James Madison still feels modern. Many people today also live between ideals and convenience. They believe one thing, depend upon another, and postpone the moment when contradiction demands a decision. Madison would spend his life building arguments about freedom, balance, and restraint. Yet he would never fully escape the system into which he had been born. History does not always offer clean heroes. Sometimes it offers flawed people whose greatest achievements stand beside failures they could not overcome. For now, however, he remained a young man at the edge of a changing world. Beyond the windows of Montpelier, the fields moved gently in the wind. Inside, pages turned beneath candlelight. A quiet boy read about republics that had vanished centuries before, not knowing that one day his own country would ask him how a republic might survive. The question was still far away, but it was coming closer, and before he could answer it, he would first have to leave the safety of home and discover how fragile both the body and a nation could truly be. Leaving home was not simply a matter of traveling to another town. For James Madison, it meant stepping away from the sheltered rhythm of Montpelier and entering a wider world where ideas collided every day. His parents hoped education would prepare him for the responsibilities expected of a gentleman, but they could not have imagined how deeply those years would reshape the quiet boy they had watched struggle through childhood illnesses. Many young men from wealthy Virginia families chose the College of William and Mary. It was close to home, familiar, and closely tied to the traditions of the colony. James made a different choice. He traveled north to the College of New Jersey, the institution that would later become Princeton University. The journey itself carried symbolic weight, with every kilometer between himself and Virginia. He also placed distance between inherited assumptions and the possibility of discovering a new way of thinking. The campus was smaller than many people today might imagine. Yet, to James, it felt like an entirely different universe. Students arrived from various colonies, bringing with them different accents, beliefs, and experiences. Conversations no longer revolved only around local affairs. Debates stretched across religion, philosophy, science, literature, and politics. Every meal could become a classroom. Every walk across the grounds might begin with an ordinary greeting and end with a discussion about human nature or the future of society. Among the people who influenced him most was the college president, John Witherspoon. Unlike many educators who focused only on memorization, Witherspoon challenged students to think independently. He believed that learning meant far more than repeating accepted ideas. A truly educated person should question, compare, and reason. Those lessons reached James at exactly the right moment. He had already developed a habit of careful reading. Now, he was encouraged to transform that habit into disciplined judgment. Witherspoon introduced his students to the great thinkers of Europe, but he also reminded them that knowledge should never remain trapped inside books. Philosophy mattered because it shaped governments. Ethics mattered because it shaped leaders. Religion mattered because it shaped conscience. Every abstract idea eventually found its way into ordinary life. James absorbed these lessons with unusual seriousness. He was no longer reading history simply to admire the past. He was beginning to ask how history might guide the future. His classmates soon noticed something distinctive about him. He was not the loudest speaker in a debate. He rarely tried to dominate a conversation. Instead, he listened carefully, allowing others to reveal their assumptions before quietly offering an argument so well prepared that it was difficult to dismiss. Some students won attention through confidence. James earned respect through precision. Every sentence seemed to rest upon hours of thought that no one else had witnessed. His schedule became exhausting, determined to master every subject available. He compressed years of study into a remarkably short period. While many students followed the ordinary pace of the curriculum, James pushed himself far beyond it. He read late into the night by candlelight. He reviewed ancient languages, philosophy, mathematics, moral science, and rhetoric with relentless discipline. Sleep became an inconvenience rather than a necessity. There were evenings when the silence of the library lasted longer than the conversations in the dormitories. Such dedication came with a price. His health, already fragile, began to suffer once again. Periods of extreme fatigue returned. Headaches became frequent. Friends worried that he demanded more from his body than it could safely give. There were moments when James himself feared that his determination might shorten his life. Yet, instead of slowing down, he seemed driven by a quiet urgency, as though some invisible clock continued ticking inside him. Perhaps he believed that knowledge gained today could never be taken away, while tomorrow remained uncertain. One cannot help wondering what passed through his mind during those long nights. The candle burned lower with every passing hour. Outside, the campus grew silent beneath the darkness. Inside, a young student turned another page, searching for answers that history itself had struggled to provide. Could a government protect liberty without collapsing into chaos? Could people govern themselves without eventually surrendering power to ambition? These were no longer distant philosophical puzzles. They were becoming deeply personal questions. The more James studied the ancient republics of Greece and Rome, the more fascinated he became by their failures. Civilizations did not usually disappear overnight. They weakened gradually. Factions turned citizens against one another. Leaders sought personal glory instead of public good. Institutions lost the trust of ordinary people. Freedom slipped away one compromise at a time. These patterns repeated themselves across centuries with unsettling consistency. If history taught anything, it was that no republic survived forever, simply because its founders hoped it would. Instead of discouraging him, those lessons sharpened his curiosity. Perhaps republics failed because earlier generations had not fully understood the weaknesses of human nature. Perhaps governments needed stronger safeguards against pride, greed, and the desire for absolute power. James did not imagine politics as a contest between perfect heroes and obvious villains. He believed every person carried both virtue and weakness. If that was true, then a successful government could never depend entirely upon good intentions. It had to be designed with human imperfection in mind. This quiet realization would remain with him for the rest of his life. While James immersed himself in study, the world beyond the college walls continued to grow more unsettled. News traveled slowly compared with modern standards, yet every newspaper seemed to carry fresh signs of disagreement between the colonies and the British government. Taxes became symbols of larger questions. Authority itself was increasingly challenged. Conversations once whispered in private were now spoken openly in taverns, churches, and public squares. Students argued passionately about these events. Some defended loyalty to the crown. Others believed the colonies deserved greater independence. The campus reflected the uncertainty of an entire generation, standing between tradition and change. James listened more than he spoke, but every discussion added another layer to his understanding. Political conflict was rarely as simple as one side being entirely right and the other completely wrong. Beneath every disagreement lay competing fears, competing hopes, and competing visions of the future. After completing his studies, James surprised many people by remaining at the college for additional months. Rather than immediately beginning a professional career, he spent the extra time reading under Witherspoon's guidance, expanding his knowledge even further. There was no urgency to seek fame. There was no desire to impress society with quick achievements. He seemed content to strengthen the foundations before attempting to build anything upon them. Eventually, however, the familiar call of home became impossible to ignore. He returned to Virginia, carrying far more than books and notes. He brought back a transformed way of seeing the world. The plantation looked much the same as before. The hills still rolled gently toward the horizon. The tobacco fields still stretched across the landscape. Yet, James himself had changed. Once a person learns to examine society through the lens of history, philosophy, and human nature, ordinary scenes are never entirely ordinary again. The contradiction surrounding him appeared sharper than ever. Discussions about liberty echoed across the colonies, yet enslaved workers continued their labor beneath the same southern sun. Respected gentlemen praised justice while benefiting from unequal systems. Churches preached moral truth, while communities accepted practices that seemed increasingly difficult to reconcile with those teachings. James observed these tensions with growing unease. He did not yet know how they could be resolved, but he could no longer pretend they did not exist. Another challenge also awaited him. Despite years of education, he remained uncertain about his future. He had no clear profession. He was not naturally drawn toward business. Military life seemed impossible because of his fragile health. The path ahead looked strangely empty. For a young man gifted with extraordinary intelligence, uncertainty could feel almost heavier than failure itself. He did not realize that history was quietly preparing an answer. Before long, Events beyond his control would draw him away from private study and into public life. The arguments he had practiced in classrooms would soon be tested against the demands of revolution, and the shy student who preferred libraries to crowds would discover that sometimes the people least eager for power become the ones most capable of carrying its burden. When James Madison returned to Virginia, he carried no title that impressed strangers and no clear plan for the years ahead. He possessed an extraordinary education, a disciplined mind, and shelves of carefully gathered knowledge. Yet none of those things answered the question that quietly followed him from day to day. What was he meant to do with his life? For many young men of his social standing, the answer appeared obvious. They would manage family estates, expand their wealth, marry well, and gradually inherit positions of influence. James could have followed that familiar path. But something inside him resisted the comfort of an ordinary future. His health continued to cast a long shadow over every decision. Periods of exhaustion still appeared without warning. Some mornings he awoke with energy, convinced he could accomplish anything. On others, even simple tasks demanded unexpected effort. Those around him often wondered whether he pushed himself too hard, while James himself wondered whether he had enough time to make his life meaningful. Uncertainty has a strange way of sharpening ambition. When tomorrow feels uncertain, today becomes impossible to waste. Instead of rushing into public life, he withdrew once again into study. Montpelier became both a home and a private academy. Books arrived from Europe as quickly as they could cross the Atlantic Ocean. Philosophy, history, law, economics, theology, and political theory filled his days. Visitors sometimes found him surrounded by open volumes, handwritten notes scattered across his desk, each page connected to another by invisible threads of thought. He was not collecting information for its own sake. He was quietly building a framework for understanding human society. One question refused to leave him. Why do free people eventually surrender their freedom? He searched for the answer across centuries of history. Athens had once celebrated democracy, yet internal conflict weakened it. The Roman Republic achieved greatness before ambition slowly transformed it into empire. Kingdoms had risen with promises of justice, only to become instruments of oppression. The pattern repeated itself so often that it seemed almost unavoidable. Human beings desired liberty, but they also desired power. Sooner or later, those two desires collided. The more James reflected upon history, the less he believed that good intentions alone could preserve a nation. Every generation begins with hope. Every generation believes its leaders are wiser than those who came before. Yet history whispered a different lesson. People remained imperfect. Pride survived every century. Greed changed its clothing, but never disappeared. Anger could spread faster than wisdom. If a government expected perfect citizens, it was already destined to fail. These ideas remained private for the moment, but they slowly shaped the way he looked at everything around him. Virginia itself had become a place of growing political conversation. In town squares, churches, taverns, and private homes, ordinary people discussed taxes, trade, representation, and authority with increasing intensity. What had once sounded like isolated complaints now felt connected. Each conversation added another piece to a much larger picture. The relationship between the colonies and Great Britain was changing, and almost everyone sensed that the old balance could not last forever. James listened carefully. He always listened before speaking. That habit would become one of his greatest strengths. While others rushed to declare certainty, he searched for hidden assumptions. While others reacted emotionally to the latest news, he tried to understand the deeper forces driving events. He knew that history rarely turned because of a single speech or one dramatic decision. Change usually gathered quietly beneath the surface, until suddenly the world appeared different overnight. During these years, another issue began to trouble him deeply: religious liberty. Today, Freedom of worship feels like a natural principle in many democratic societies. During James's lifetime, however, religion often remained closely connected to political authority. Certain churches enjoyed legal privileges, while others faced restrictions, discrimination, or punishment. In parts of Virginia, ministers from minority denominations could even be arrested simply for preaching without official approval. Those stories disturbed James profoundly. He visited imprisoned Baptist ministers whose only offense had been preaching according to their conscience. He listened as ordinary believers described fines, harassment, and suspicion from local authorities. The experience left a lasting impression upon him. If government possessed the power to control faith, where would that power eventually stop? If conscience itself required official permission, could any freedom truly be secure? The question reached beyond religion. It became a question about human dignity. Every person, James believed, possessed an inner world that no government should dominate completely. Laws could regulate actions, but belief belonged to something deeper. This conviction would later influence some of the most important political principles in American history. But at the time, it existed only as a growing certainty inside a thoughtful young man still searching for his place. His reputation slowly expanded. Neighbors recognized his intelligence. Local leaders sought his opinion on legal and political matters. Although naturally shy, James earned trust because people understood he spoke carefully rather than impulsively. He never treated disagreement as a personal insult. Instead, he examined opposing arguments with remarkable fairness before offering his own conclusions. Many who met him noticed the contrast between his quiet manner and the strength of his reasoning. Authority did not come from volume. It came from preparation. Yet even as respect grew, so did the tension surrounding the colonies. News from Boston spread throughout America. Protests became more frequent. British officials responded with increasing determination. Each attempt to restore order seemed only to deepen resentment. Families gathered around newspapers, eager for the latest reports arriving from distant cities. Conversations that once centered upon harvests or local affairs increasingly turned toward politics. Ordinary people who had never imagined participating in history suddenly found themselves living inside it. James watched these developments with mixed emotions. He admired stability. He feared violence, but he also understood that peace without justice could become another form of oppression. These competing thoughts occupied his mind during long walks across the fields surrounding Montpelier. Nature appeared unchanged. Birds continued their songs. Rivers followed familiar paths. Seasons arrived with quiet certainty. Yet beneath that peaceful landscape, an entire society moved toward confrontation. History often behaves like a distant storm. At first, only the horizon darkens. Then the wind changes. Finally, everyone realizes the storm has been approaching all along. Friends occasionally encouraged James to pursue military service. If conflict eventually erupted, the suggestion revealed how deeply courage was associated with physical strength during the 18th century. James knew his own limitations. Illness had accompanied him too faithfully for him to imagine becoming a successful soldier. At first, this realization disappointed him. Every young man wanted to contribute when his community faced uncertainty, but gradually, he began to recognize that nations require more than warriors. They also require thinkers. They require people capable of designing institutions strong enough to survive long after battles have ended. Without fully realizing it, James was preparing for a different kind of service. He would not become famous because of victories won upon battlefields. His greatest battles would unfold across tables covered with papers, inside crowded meeting halls, through carefully chosen words, and across thousands of handwritten pages where every sentence carried consequences far beyond the moment it was written. Still, none of that future could yet be seen. He remained simply James Madison, a thoughtful young Virginian whose greatest talents were known only to a small circle of family, teachers, and friends. The world had not learned his name. Newspapers rarely mentioned him. History had not yet invited him onto its stage. But history was moving toward him with increasing speed. Before long, local politics would draw him into public service. Once he accepted that first responsibility, there would be no returning to the quiet life of uninterrupted study. The questions that had filled his books would soon demand real answers, and the shy scholar who had spent years preparing in silence would discover that destiny often arrives without announcing itself, asking ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things before they have time to believe they are ready. The opportunity arrived almost quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no grand ceremony, and no sense that history had just opened a new chapter. James Madison entered public life through local service, accepting responsibilities that appeared modest compared with the enormous events unfolding around the colonies. Yet, history often hides its greatest turning points inside moments that seem entirely ordinary. A single appointment, a single meeting, or a single decision can redirect an entire life without anyone recognizing its importance until many years later. By the time James accepted his first political responsibilities, the atmosphere across America had become increasingly tense. Trust between the colonies and the British government continued to weaken. Each new law, each new protest, and each new attempt to restore order seemed only to widen the distance between those who governed and those who believed they deserved a greater voice in shaping their own future. For James, politics was never about popularity. It was never about standing before crowds to receive applause. It was about solving problems that appeared too complicated for simple answers. While many public figures became known for passionate speeches, James quickly earned another reputation. He prepared more thoroughly than almost anyone else. Before entering a meeting, he studied every available document. Before expressing an opinion, he examined every argument he could imagine, including those he personally disagreed with. He believed that careless words could damage a nation just as surely as careless actions. This habit sometimes made him appear quiet, and people unfamiliar with him occasionally mistook silence for uncertainty. They could not see that silence was often the sound of careful thinking. When James finally spoke, his words carried unusual weight because those around him understood they had not been chosen carelessly. One of the first issues that demanded his attention was religious liberty, a subject that had occupied his thoughts long before he entered politics. Virginia still maintained laws that favored certain religious institutions while placing unnecessary burdens upon others. Many people accepted this arrangement simply because it had existed for generations. James refused to accept that tradition alone could justify injustice. He remembered the imprisoned ministers he had visited. He remembered the conversations with ordinary believers whose only desire was the freedom to worship according to their conscience. Those memories had never left him. They convinced him that freedom loses much of its meaning if governments possess the authority to control what people sincerely believe. To James, liberty was not something that could be divided into convenient pieces. If one freedom depended entirely upon government approval, then every other freedom eventually stood upon uncertain ground as well. This conviction gradually shaped his public voice. He argued that faith must belong to the individual rather than the state. True belief, he insisted, cannot be created through force. Laws may regulate behavior. They may punish crime. They may organize society, but they cannot command genuine conviction inside the human heart. Such ideas sounded bold during the 18th century. Many respected leaders feared that separating religion from government would weaken public morality. James believed the opposite. Faith became stronger, not weaker, when it rested upon personal conviction instead of legal obligation. People should choose belief because they believed it was true, not because officials demanded obedience. These arguments revealed something important about his character. He rarely attacked people. Instead, he challenged ideas. Rather than accusing opponents of bad intentions, he invited them to examine the consequences of their assumptions. This calm style frustrated some critics because anger often seeks another angry voice in return. James rarely provided one. He preferred reason over outrage, patience over impulse, and careful persuasion over dramatic confrontation. Outside legislative chambers, however, events continued moving toward open conflict. The colonies and Great Britain drifted further apart with every passing month. News traveled from town to town, describing fresh protests, new restrictions, growing resistance, and increasingly bitter political disagreements. Newspapers no longer reported isolated incidents. Together, they formed the outline of a crisis that seemed impossible to ignore. Ordinary families sensed that familiar life was beginning to disappear. Merchants worried about trade. Farmers worried about taxes. Parents wondered what kind of future awaited their children. Even people who disliked political arguments found themselves discussing them around dinner tables because politics had entered nearly every part of daily life. James observed these developments with growing concern. He understood that revolutions often begin with noble ideals, but can end in bitterness if guided only by emotion. History had taught him that anger alone rarely builds lasting institutions. Destroying an old system might happen quickly. Creating a better one demanded patience, wisdom, and self-restraint. Without those qualities, today's liberators could easily become tomorrow's oppressors. That realization separated him from many of his contemporaries. While others focused primarily upon resisting British authority, James had already begun asking a different question. What kind of nation should exist after independence? The answer seemed obvious. To some, freedom. But James believed that freedom without structure could dissolve into disorder. Liberty required laws. Laws required institutions. Institutions required balance. And balance required an honest understanding of human nature. He had reached a conclusion that would remain with him throughout his life. People are capable of remarkable generosity. They are also capable of remarkable selfishness. Any government that ignored either truth would eventually fail. Around this time, James became involved with committees and local conventions where representatives gathered to discuss the colony's response to unfolding events. These meetings demanded long hours, detailed preparation, and endless compromise. Disagreements emerged constantly. Some delegates preferred cautious negotiation. Others demanded immediate action. Personalities clashed. Ambitions surfaced. Tempers occasionally overwhelmed reason. James watched all of it closely. Each meeting became another lesson. He discovered that political success depended not only upon having good ideas, but also upon understanding people. Fear influenced decisions as much as logic. Pride could prevent agreement, even when everyone sought similar goals. Sometimes, progress required listening, far longer than speaking. These experiences strengthened a skill he had quietly developed since childhood. He knew how to bring opposing viewpoints into the same conversation without allowing the discussion to collapse into hostility. He searched for common principles, hidden beneath visible disagreements. He looked beyond personalities toward larger purposes. It was not an exciting talent. Newspapers rarely celebrated compromise. Crowds preferred dramatic heroes. Yet nations often survive because someone inside the room refuses to let every disagreement become permanent. Friends occasionally remarked that James possessed an unusual combination of humility and determination. He never appeared eager for recognition. He did not seek attention for its own sake, but once convinced that an idea served the public good, he defended it with remarkable persistence. His quiet voice concealed extraordinary resolve. Meanwhile, the possibility of war no longer seemed distant. Militia units organized throughout the colonies. Young men prepared for military service. Families discussed the sacrifices that might soon become unavoidable. James wished he could contribute in every possible way, Yet he remained painfully aware of his physical limitations. Illness continued to remind him that his greatest strength would never lie upon a battlefield. For a brief time, this troubled him. Would history remember only soldiers? Would thoughtful men always remain in the background? Those doubts did not last forever. Slowly, he came to understand that every revolution requires more than courage with weapons. Someone must also imagine the peace that follows victory. Someone must design institutions capable of protecting freedom after the celebrations end. Someone must ask difficult questions while others remain focused upon immediate dangers. Without realizing it, James was preparing for exactly that responsibility. He stood at the edge of events, far greater than himself. The colonies were approaching the point where debate would become revolution. And revolution would demand not only brave fighters, but wise builders. The years of quiet study, careful observation, and patient reflection had not separated James Madison from history. They had been preparing him for the moment when a fragile young scholar would be asked to help shape the future of an entirely new nation. The first months of revolution rarely feel heroic to the people living through them. Uncertainty hangs over every conversation. Rumors travel faster than facts. Yesterday's neighbor may hold a completely different vision of tomorrow. While newspapers carried stories of growing resistance, James Madison understood that anger alone could not secure the future. If the colonies succeeded in breaking away from British rule, they would face an even more difficult challenge. They would have to learn how to govern themselves without repeating the same mistakes that had destroyed so many republics before them. That realization quietly changed the direction of his life. Many young patriots dreamed of military glory. They imagined victory through courage on the battlefield. Believing independence would naturally follow, James admired their sacrifice. But he saw another struggle unfolding beneath the surface. Armies might win a war, yet only wise institutions could preserve the peace afterward. History was filled with nations that had defeated foreign enemies only to collapse under the weight of their own internal divisions. His opportunity to contribute came through the Virginia Convention and later the Committee of Safety, where he worked alongside experienced political leaders trying to prepare the colony for uncertain days ahead. These gatherings were rarely dramatic. Hours disappeared in discussions about supplies, communication, local defense, and administration. Outsiders often imagined politics as a series of powerful speeches, but James quickly discovered that the future of a nation was usually shaped through long conversations, difficult compromises, and endless attention to detail. This environment suited him perfectly. While others grew impatient with lengthy debate, James believed careful preparation prevented disastrous decisions. He read reports before meetings. He organized facts with almost mathematical precision. He anticipated objections before they were raised. His colleagues gradually realized that the quiet young delegate often entered a discussion better prepared than men twice his age. Preparation became his invisible advantage. He understood something many ambitious politicians overlooked. Confidence, without knowledge, could inspire people for a single afternoon. Knowledge, supported by discipline, could influence generations. As revolutionary sentiment spread, another lesson became increasingly clear. People who agreed about independence often disagreed sharply about almost everything else. Some wanted strong local governments. Others preferred greater cooperation between the colonies. Some feared concentrated authority above all else. Others worried that excessive local independence would produce endless conflict. James listened carefully to every side. He resisted the temptation to divide people into heroes and villains. Experience had already taught him that sincere individuals could honestly reach opposite conclusions while pursuing the same goal. This habit of seeking understanding before judgment later became one of the defining characteristics of his political philosophy. During these demanding months, he also formed friendships with several remarkable figures whose influence would shape American history. Among them was Thomas Jefferson, Although their personalities differed in many ways, both men shared a deep interest in liberty, education, and the future of Republican government. Conversations between them often moved beyond immediate political questions into broader reflections about human nature, justice, and the responsibilities carried by free citizens. These discussions strengthened James's growing belief that independence represented only the beginning of a much larger journey. Declaring freedom was one thing. Learning how to preserve it was another entirely. Outside meeting halls, ordinary life continued beneath the shadow of approaching conflict. Families harvested crops, merchants opened their shops, children played beneath familiar trees, and church bells still echoed across small communities. Yet beneath these ordinary scenes lived a quiet awareness that everything might soon change. Fathers wondered whether they would be called to fight. Mothers prepared households for uncertain futures. Young people spoke of liberty with excitement, while older generations carried memories of previous conflicts and understood how easily enthusiasm could be replaced by grief. James often reflected upon these ordinary people. Politics, in his mind, was never an abstract game played by ambitious leaders. Every law eventually reached someone's home. Every decision made inside a legislative chamber altered the lives of farmers, craftsmen, merchants, teachers, ministers, and children who would never participate directly in political debates. Governments existed to serve people, not the other way around. This simple conviction quietly guided almost every position he would later defend. His own health remained unpredictable. Long hours of work frequently left him exhausted. There were evenings when headaches forced him away from his papers, despite his desire to continue reading. Friends urged him to rest more often, fearing that constant labor would permanently damage his already fragile body. James listened politely, yet he rarely changed his habits. He carried an unspoken sense that time remained precious. Every day offered another opportunity to prepare for responsibilities he could not yet fully imagine. There were moments when he questioned himself. Was he truly suited for public life? He disliked unnecessary attention. Large crowds drained his energy rather than inspiring it. He preferred thoughtful conversations to emotional speeches. Sometimes he wondered whether history favored louder personalities. Yet, whenever uncertainty appeared, another conviction quietly replaced it. A nation did not need every leader to speak with thunder. Sometimes it needed someone willing to think carefully, while everyone else hurried toward conclusions. That realization gave him confidence. Not confidence rooted in ego, confidence rooted in purpose. As the revolutionary movement gathered momentum, the colonies began moving toward cooperation on a scale few had previously imagined. Representatives traveled long distances to exchange ideas, coordinate responses, and search for common ground, despite regional differences. James watched these efforts with growing fascination. 13 separate colonies possessed different economies, traditions, and interests. If they struggled to cooperate while confronting a common enemy, how would they govern together after victory? Once again, history offered uncomfortable warnings. Ancient alliances had often collapsed because individual regions placed local advantage above shared survival. Jealousy, rivalry, and mistrust slowly weakened governments from within until external enemies merely delivered the final blow. James refused to ignore those lessons. Instead, he filled notebooks with observations. He compared present events with ancient examples. He studied every successful federation he could find, while paying equal attention to those that had failed. These private studies gradually evolved into a central belief. Lasting freedom required balance. Too much centralized authority threatened liberty. Too little authority invited chaos. Somewhere between those extremes lay a system capable of protecting both order and individual rights. He did not yet know exactly what that system would look like, but he had begun searching for it. Meanwhile, events moved with increasing speed. The language of compromise slowly disappeared. The the possibility of peaceful reconciliation became more distant. Communities prepared themselves emotionally for sacrifices that could no longer be avoided. Young men enlisted. Families said difficult farewells. The familiar rhythms of colonial life gave way to the uncertain pace of revolution. James could feel history accelerating around him. The quiet years devoted to books and reflection were ending. Ahead waited responsibilities far greater than any he had previously imagined. Soon, he would leave local politics behind and enter a wider stage where the fate of every colony would be debated. There, he would meet extraordinary leaders, confront impossible questions, and discover that building a nation demanded far more patience than destroying an empire. The scholar who had spent so many nights studying the failures of ancient republics was about to face the greatest challenge of his life, finding a way to ensure that America would not become one more forgotten experiment buried beneath the pages of history. When the Second Continental Congress assembled, few people paid much attention to the quiet delegate from Virginia. The room contained men whose reputations already stretched across the colonies. Some were celebrated lawyers, others were wealthy merchants, experienced soldiers, or gifted speakers whose words could electrify an audience. Within moments, compared with them, James Madison appeared almost invisible. He was neither physically imposing nor naturally charismatic. If a stranger had entered the chamber without knowing the names of its delegates, there was little reason to believe that this soft-spoken young man would someday shape the political future of an entire nation. Yet history has a curious habit. It often grants lasting influence, not to those who speak first, but to those who understand the problem most deeply. James spent his earliest weeks observing far more than speaking. While passionate debates echoed through meeting halls, he watched personalities as carefully as policies. Some delegates relied upon emotion, others relied upon reputation. Many possessed unquestionable courage, yet courage alone did not guarantee wisdom. James understood that building agreement among independent colonies demanded something more difficult than winning an argument. It required convincing people with different fears, different ambitions, and different traditions that they shared a common future. Those conversations continued from morning until late into the evening. Formal meetings blended into private discussions. Ideas begun around conference tables continued during evening meals. Letters arrived daily, carrying reports from distant towns, military camps, and local governments. Every new message reminded the delegates that events outside the meeting hall moved faster than the decisions inside it. The pressure grew heavier with every passing week. While representatives debated principles, ordinary people waited for answers, soldiers waited for supplies, local governments waited for direction, families waited to discover whether tomorrow would bring peace or another step toward war. James felt the weight of that responsibility deeply. He knew that every delayed decision carried consequences far beyond the walls surrounding them. Yet he also refused to support reckless action simply because others demanded speed. Patience remained one of his greatest strengths. He believed that hurried mistakes often required generations to repair. During this period, he worked closely with several leaders whose names would later become inseparable from the founding of the United States. Among them was George Washington, another Virginian whose character left a lasting impression upon him. Washington possessed a calm dignity that inspired confidence without demanding attention. Unlike many ambitious men, he rarely sought admiration for its own sake. James recognized in him the rare ability to place public duty above personal ambition. Washington taught James another important lesson. True leadership often appears quieter than people expect. It is measured less by dramatic speeches than by steady judgment during moments of uncertainty. This observation strengthened James's own natural instincts. He did not need to imitate louder personalities. He simply needed to become the best version of himself. As military conflict expanded, the practical difficulties facing the colonies became increasingly obvious. Each colony maintained its own government, its own priorities, and its own understanding of how resources should be shared. Cooperation proved far more complicated than many patriots had imagined. Local interests frequently competed with national needs. Promises made enthusiastically in public sometimes disappeared when difficult sacrifices became necessary. James studied these problems with growing concern. Winning independence would accomplish little if the colonies remained unable to cooperate afterward. He began filling page after page with observations about the weaknesses of divided governments. Whenever disagreements delayed essential decisions, he quietly asked himself whether the problem lay not only with individual leaders, but with the political structure itself. Perhaps the system had been designed too weakly. Perhaps good intentions alone could never overcome competing interests. These thoughts gradually formed the foundation of ideas that would later define his career. At the same time, the emotional cost of revolution became impossible to ignore. Lists of casualties arrived from distant battlefields. Families mourned fathers, brothers, and sons who never returned home. Villages that had once discussed crops and trade now spoke of military campaigns and uncertain futures. For James, every report reinforced the belief that political failure carried a human price. Arguments inside legislative chambers were never merely intellectual exercises. Behind every decision stood countless ordinary lives. This awareness made him even more determined to approach every question with humility. Certainty, he believed, could become dangerous when mixed with power. Leaders should remain willing to question themselves, because the consequences of arrogance were measured not in wounded pride, but in human suffering. Although naturally reserved, James slowly earned the confidence of his fellow delegates. They discovered that his greatest contribution often came before meetings even began. He arrived thoroughly prepared. He mastered documents others had only skimmed. He remembered details forgotten by everyone else. He connected present problems with historical examples stretching back centuries. People soon realized that if James expressed concern about an issue, they would be wise to examine it carefully. His quiet reputation grew steadily, not through publicity, through reliability. There were evenings when he returned to his room completely exhausted. The physical demands of constant work remained difficult for someone whose health had never been strong. Headaches returned. Periods of weakness interrupted his concentration. Yet almost every morning found him once again surrounded by papers, letters, books, and notes. He seemed driven by an invisible sense of responsibility, stronger than physical discomfort. Friends occasionally worried that he demanded too much of himself. Perhaps they were right, but James understood something many people discover only much later in life. Purpose has its own kind of strength. A person may grow tired, the body may ask for rest, yet the mind continues because it believes the work truly matters. Outside the Congress, public opinion shifted almost daily. Victories encouraged hope, defeats encouraged doubt. Rumors spread rapidly through cities and villages alike. Some predicted certain triumph, others feared complete disaster. James resisted both extremes. History had taught him that lasting change rarely followed a straight path. Progress advanced, then retreated. Confidence rose, then disappeared. The challenge was not to avoid uncertainty, but to continue making thoughtful decisions despite it. This calm perspective quietly distinguished him from many contemporaries. He did not become intoxicated by success. He did not surrender to despair after setbacks. Instead, he focused upon the long future, waiting beyond the immediate crisis. One question returned again and again. What kind of government would emerge when the fighting finally ended? The answer could no longer be postponed. Military victory alone would not unite 13 independent states with different traditions and competing interests. They needed institutions capable of balancing freedom with stability. They needed laws respected by both large and small states. They needed a government strong enough to survive, but limited enough to prevent tyranny. James sensed that these challenges would soon demand his full attention. The years spent studying ancient republics, reflecting upon religion, observing political conflict, and preparing with quiet discipline had not been separate chapters of his life. They had all been leading toward the same destination. The revolution was transforming him from a thoughtful observer into a national statesman. And although he could not yet see the full shape of the future, he understood one essential truth: the hardest part of creating a free nation would begin only after independence had been won, because defeating an empire required courage, but designing a republic that could endure for centuries would require something even rarer: the wisdom to understand both the greatness and the weakness that exist inside every human heart. Independence arrived with celebration, but the celebration did not last very long. Church bells rang, crowds gathered, and families allowed themselves to believe that the hardest years were finally behind them. Yet when the noise faded, a more unsettling truth remained. The former colonies had won the right to govern themselves, but they had not agreed on how that government should actually work. The war had removed British authority. It had not automatically created unity, stability, or trust among 13 states that had spent generations protecting their own interests. James Madison understood the danger almost immediately. He had never believed that victory on a battlefield could solve every political problem. Freedom was not a finished monument that could be unveiled after the final battle. It was more like a fragile structure that had to be built slowly, repaired constantly, and protected from the weaknesses of the very people who lived inside it. The nation had survived an external enemy, but Madison feared that its greatest threats might now come from within. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states remained loosely connected. The national government could discuss urgent problems, negotiate with foreign powers, and request money from the states, but it possessed little authority to enforce its decisions. Congress could ask for financial support, yet the states could refuse. It could recommend cooperation. Yet local leaders often placed regional interests above national needs. On paper, this arrangement appeared to protect liberty. In daily practice, it created confusion, delay, and growing frustration. Many Americans considered the weakness of the central government a virtue. They remembered the authority of the British Crown and feared replacing one distant power with another. Strong government sounded dangerous because strong governments throughout history had often become oppressive. These fears were real, and Madison respected them. He had no desire to create another monarchy disguised beneath Republican language. However, he also recognized a truth that many people were reluctant to admit: power could threaten freedom, but complete political weakness could threaten it as well. The young nation struggled beneath heavy debts left by the war. Soldiers who had sacrificed years of their lives waited for promised compensation. Merchants faced uncertain trade conditions. Foreign nations watched closely, wondering whether the United States possessed enough unity to honor agreements. Individual states printed their own money, imposed competing commercial rules, and sometimes treated one another almost like foreign countries. The revolution had created independence, but independence without coordination was slowly becoming another form of instability. Madison studied each problem with the patience of a physician, examining symptoms. He did not believe these crises were separate accidents. Financial disorder, interstate conflict, weak diplomacy, and public unrest all appeared connected to the same deeper illness. The political structure itself was inadequate. The Articles of Confederation had been designed during a war, when the greatest fear was concentrated authority. Now, the country faced a different danger. It had created a government so cautious about power that it could barely perform the basic duties of government. Once again, Madison turned to history. He studied ancient leagues, failed republics, and European alliances that had attempted to unite independent regions beneath a shared political system. Night after night, He filled pages with observations about why they had survived or collapsed. The pattern disturbed him. Confederations often appeared strongest during moments of common danger. Once the danger passed, local rivalries returned, shared sacrifice gave way to suspicion, and unity slowly dissolved into competition. He began to understand that a durable republic required more than friendship among states. Friendship could weaken, promises could be ignored, temporary agreement could disappear whenever sacrifice became inconvenient. The nation needed laws that reached beyond recommendations. It needed an authority capable of regulating trade, raising revenue, defending common interests, and responding to emergencies. Yet that authority also had to remain limited, divided, and accountable. The problem was not simply creating power. The problem was creating power that could control itself. This search for balance became the central purpose of Madison's political life. He rejected both extremes. Absolute central authority threatened tyranny, while complete state independence threatened national collapse. Somewhere between them existed a structure strong enough to govern and restrained enough to preserve liberty. Finding that middle path would demand more than inspiration. It would require knowledge of law, history, economics, human ambition, and the fears that ordinary citizens carried after years of war. Madison communicated constantly with leaders across the country. Letters traveled slowly over rough roads, yet they formed a network of political thought, stretching from Virginia to New England and beyond. These exchanges allowed him to see the nation more clearly than many officials who remained focused only on their own states. Merchants described commercial disputes. Veterans wrote about unpaid debts. Diplomats warned that European governments viewed America as weak. Each letter confirmed that the crisis was national, even when its symptoms appeared local. Then came an event that transformed private concern into public alarm. In Massachusetts, struggling farmers faced heavy taxes, debt, and the threat of losing their property. Many had served during the Revolution and returned home expecting greater security. Instead, they found hardship. Anger grew until armed groups began preventing courts from operating. The uprising became known as Shays's Rebellion, named after one of its leaders, Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain. To some observers, the rebellion proved that ordinary citizens were becoming lawless. To others, it revealed the suffering of people ignored by distant political leaders. Madison saw both sides. He understood the desperation of farmers who believed the system had failed them. He also feared what might happen when economic pain turned into organized violence. A republic depended upon public consent, but it also depended upon laws. When citizens lost faith in institutions, and institutions lacked the strength to respond, liberty itself entered dangerous territory. The national government could do almost nothing. There was no dependable army ready to restore order. Private funds helped support a force that eventually ended the uprising. The rebellion itself was limited, but the lesson was enormous. The United States had defeated the British Empire, yet it struggled to manage unrest within one state. Across the country, leaders who had previously dismissed calls for reform began to reconsider. The weaknesses Madison had described no longer sounded theoretical. George Washington was deeply troubled by the news. After the war, he had returned to Mount Vernon, hoping to live quietly and avoid political conflict. He had already given more years to public service than most people could imagine. Yet letters, arriving from former officers and political leaders, described a nation drifting toward disorder. Washington feared that the sacrifices of the revolution might be wasted if the new republic collapsed before it had time to mature. Madison knew that Washington's involvement could change everything. No other American possessed the same level of public trust. People who disagreed about almost every political question still respected the former commander. His presence could reassure citizens that constitutional reform was not a secret attempt to destroy liberty. Madison joined others in carefully encouraging Washington to attend a gathering of delegates in Philadelphia. The request placed duty against the peaceful retirement Washington deeply desired. Eventually, Washington agreed. His decision gave the coming convention a seriousness it might otherwise have lacked. Madison now understood that the opportunity he had been waiting for was approaching. Representatives from the states would meet officially to repair the Articles of Confederation. Madison already believed repair would not be enough. The old structure was too weak, its foundation too deeply flawed. America did not need another temporary adjustment. It needed an entirely new constitutional design. During the months before the convention, Madison prepared with extraordinary intensity. He studied governments from across history, compared systems of representation, examined the causes of faction, and considered how large and small states might share power while others traveled to Philadelphia, carrying opinions. He intended to arrive carrying a plan. The quiet scholar was no longer simply observing the failures of republics. He was preparing to challenge centuries of political history and prove that a free government could be both strong and restrained. When he finally began the journey north, the stakes could hardly have been greater. If the convention failed, the Union might slowly fracture. If it created too much power, the revolution's promise could be betrayed. If it created too little, disorder might continue until the people demanded a ruler strong enough to end it. Somewhere inside that narrow space between tyranny and collapse, James Madison hoped to build a republic capable of surviving human ambition, public anger, regional jealousy, and the long test of time. When the delegates gathered in Philadelphia during the spring of 1787, few realized that they were about to participate in one of the most important political meetings in modern history. Officially, they had come to revise the Articles of Confederation. That was the public purpose announced to the states. Yet as conversations began behind closed doors, it quickly became clear that simple revisions would never solve the nation's deepest problems. The foundation itself had become unstable. Repairing a crumbling structure would only delay its collapse. If the United States hoped to survive, something entirely new had to be created. For James Madison, the convention represented the moment toward which nearly every experience of his life had quietly pointed. The years spent studying ancient republics, the endless nights reading philosophy, the careful observation of political conflict during the Revolution, and the frustration he had felt under the Articles of Confederation, all merged into a single purpose. Unlike many delegates who arrived carrying broad opinions, Madison entered the meeting with detailed research, carefully organized notes, and a practical vision for a stronger constitutional government. Before many delegates had even settled into their routines, Madison had already prepared what later became known as the Virginia Plan. Although it was formally introduced by Governor Edmund Randolph, much of its intellectual foundation came from Madison's months of relentless preparation. The proposal challenged many existing assumptions. Instead of merely strengthening the old Confederation, it suggested creating an entirely new national government built upon separate branches, each balancing the authority of the other. This was a bold idea. Many delegates immediately understood that accepting such a proposal would transform the political future of the United States forever. Others worried that the convention itself might exceed its legal authority by proposing an entirely new framework instead of simply revising the existing one. Uncertainty filled the room. Every delegate recognized that history was quietly watching. Even though none of them could predict how future generations would judge their decisions, the meetings remained secret. Windows stayed closed, despite the summer heat. Guards prevented curious citizens from entering. Delegates agreed not to reveal the details of their discussions while the convention continued. This secrecy sometimes puzzled later generations, but those inside the room believed privacy allowed honest debate without constant public pressure. They needed the freedom to change their minds, challenge one another, and test difficult ideas without fearing immediate political consequences. Day after day, the delegates argued over questions that had no easy answers. How much power should belong to the national government? How much should remain with the states? Should representation depend upon population? Or should every state possess equal influence? How could liberty be protected while still allowing government to function effectively? Each question seemed connected to another, creating a web of problems where solving one often created two more. Madison rarely approached these debates with emotion alone. Instead, he relied upon careful reasoning, supported by history. Whenever disagreements intensified, he often reminded fellow delegates that republics throughout history had collapsed because they failed to balance competing interests before conflict became uncontrollable. Human beings naturally formed groups based upon shared beliefs, economic interests, geography, religion, or personal ambition. These groups, which he called factions, could become dangerous if allowed to dominate government without restraint. Many people believed the solution was simple: eliminate factions. Madison considered that impossible. As long as people possessed different talents, different occupations, different fortunes, and different opinions, the factions would always exist. Destroying them would require destroying liberty itself, because freedom naturally allowed people to think differently from one another. Instead of attempting the impossible, government should be designed so that competing interests balanced each other rather than allowing any single group to gain permanent control. This insight became one of the convention's most influential ideas. Rather than assuming people would always behave wisely, Madison believed institutions should recognize human imperfection. Ambition could not be eliminated, but it could be directed. Power could not disappear, but it could be divided. Every branch of government should possess enough authority to perform its duties, while also limiting the authority of the others. In this way, human nature itself would become part of the constitutional design. The debates sometimes grew exhausting. Large states favored representation based upon population because their citizens greatly outnumbered those of smaller states. Delegates from smaller states feared becoming politically insignificant if population alone determined influence. Tempers occasionally flared. Some representatives even hinted that failure might lead individual states to abandon the convention altogether. For a time, the entire project appeared dangerously close to collapse. Madison refused to surrender to discouragement. He understood that compromise did not necessarily mean abandoning principles. Sometimes compromise allowed principles to survive. Patiently, delegates searched for arrangements capable of satisfying enough people to preserve the Union. Eventually, what became known as the Great Compromise emerged. One legislative chamber would represent citizens according to population, while another would provide equal representation for every state, regardless of size. Neither side received everything it wanted, yet both gained enough to continue working together. For Madison, the agreement represented something larger than political negotiation. It demonstrated that stable government required people willing to place the future above immediate victory. Perfect solutions rarely existed in public life. Successful constitutions often depended upon imperfect compromises, honestly pursued in the service of a greater good. Another painful issue remained impossible to avoid: slavery. The contradiction had existed since America declared that all people possessed certain unalienable rights. Now, the delegates faced the reality that northern and southern states held profoundly different economic systems and moral perspectives. Discussions surrounding slavery became some of the convention's most difficult moments. Madison himself recognized the contradiction between Republican ideals and human bondage. Yet he also understood that insisting upon immediate agreement risked destroying the convention before any constitution could be completed. The resulting compromises left questions unresolved that future generations would pay dearly to confront. Even as the Constitution took shape, the seeds of later conflict remained planted beneath its foundations. Madison understood that the document represented neither perfection nor finality. It was the beginning of an ongoing experiment rather than its conclusion. Throughout the long summer, his disciplined preparation continued to distinguish him from nearly everyone around him. While many delegates relied upon memory, Madison kept detailed notes describing speeches, arguments, objections, and changing positions. These records would later become one of the most valuable historical accounts of the convention itself. Without his careful observations, much of what occurred inside that room might have been lost forever. Yet, despite his extraordinary influence, Madison never behaved as though the Constitution belonged to him alone. He listened carefully. He revised ideas when persuaded by stronger arguments. He accepted necessary compromises, even when they disappointed him. His goal had never been personal victory. It had always been creating a government capable of surviving long after every delegate present had passed from history. As the convention slowly approached its conclusion, the delegates understood they had done something far greater than revising an old political system. They had drafted a constitution, unlike any the modern world had previously attempted. It created a stronger national government while deliberately dividing authority among separate branches. It trusted neither kings nor crowds completely. Instead, it trusted carefully designed institutions that recognized both the strengths and weaknesses of human nature. The document, however, was only ink upon parchment until the people accepted it. Outside Philadelphia, powerful critics already questioned whether the proposed constitution granted too much authority to the national government. Fierce public debate was about to begin, and James Madison would soon discover that writing a constitution, as difficult as it had been, was only half the battle. Convincing an entire nation to embrace it would demand every lesson, every argument, and every ounce of quiet determination. He had spent a lifetime developing. The Constitution left Philadelphia bearing the signatures of 39 delegates. But James Madison understood that the most difficult struggle had not ended inside the convention hall. In many ways, it had only begun. A constitution carried no power. Simply because respected men had written it, it would become the law of the land only if the people, through their state conventions, agreed to accept it. Across the young nation, newspapers filled with arguments, taverns echoed with political debates, and ordinary citizens began asking whether the proposed government would protect their liberty or quietly destroy it. Opposition emerged almost immediately. Many Americans admired the effort made in Philadelphia, yet they worried that the new constitution granted too much authority to the national government. They remembered the years of conflict with Great Britain and feared replacing one distant power with another. Critics argued that the president might eventually resemble a king, that Congress could become too powerful, and that the states would slowly lose the independence they had fought so hard to secure. These concerns came from people who genuinely loved their country, making the debate even more serious. Madison refused to dismiss his opponents as enemies of freedom. He understood their fears because he had once shared many of them himself. His years of study had taught him that political disagreement rarely grew from simple ignorance. Thoughtful people could honestly reach different conclusions while seeking the same goal. Because of this, he chose persuasion rather than condemnation. Instead of attacking those who questioned the Constitution, he decided to explain why its carefully designed system offered greater protection for liberty than the weak government it was meant to replace. Together with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, Madison began writing a remarkable series of essays that would later become known as the Federalist Papers, published in newspapers under the shared name Publius. These essays defended the Constitution point by point. They explained not only what the document said, but why each provision had been included and how the different parts worked together. The writers hoped to guide public opinion through reason rather than emotion, believing that informed citizens would recognize the wisdom of the proposed system. Although Hamilton conceived the idea for the essays, Madison soon became one of their most important contributors, despite his fragile health and demanding political schedule. He wrote with extraordinary discipline, night after night. He transformed years of historical study into clear arguments that ordinary readers could understand. He explained why separated powers prevented tyranny, why an independent judiciary strengthened liberty, and why representation across a large republic could actually reduce the dangers posed by competing factions. Among all the essays he produced, one became especially influential in what later became known as Federalist. Number 10. Madison addressed the problem that had occupied his thoughts for decades. Every society contained factions, groups of people united by shared interests or beliefs. Many political thinkers believed factions should be eliminated. Madison disagreed. Removing factions would require removing liberty itself. Because freedom naturally allowed people to disagree, the better solution was designing institutions so that no single faction could permanently dominate the government. This argument challenged centuries of political thinking. Rather than assuming that good government depended entirely upon virtuous leaders, Madison assumed that human beings would always possess mixed motives: ambition, jealousy, generosity, pride, wisdom, and selfishness all existed together within society. Instead of pretending these qualities could disappear, the Constitution accepted them as permanent realities. Its system of checks and balances encouraged different branches of government to limit one another, reducing the likelihood that any single individual or institution could accumulate unchecked power. While newspapers carried these essays throughout the states, public meetings grew increasingly passionate. Supporters praised the Constitution as the nation's best hope for survival. Opponents warned that it endangered the very freedoms won during the Revolution. In some communities, neighbors who had once fought side by side now found themselves standing on opposite sides of the constitutional debate. Families argued across dinner tables. Merchants discussed politics with customers. Ministers preached sermons touching upon civic responsibility. The future of the Republic became the central topic of everyday conversation. Virginia proved especially important. As one of the largest and most influential states, its decision would shape public opinion throughout the country. If Virginia rejected the Constitution, many feared that the Union itself might fail. Madison entered the state's ratifying convention, knowing the stakes could hardly have been higher. There he faced formidable opponents, including Patrick Henry, whose powerful oratory had inspired Americans since the earliest days of resistance against British rule. Patrick Henry spoke with extraordinary passion. His voice filled meeting halls, stirring emotion and awakening memories of the Revolution. Compared with such dramatic speeches, Madison appeared almost understated. He spoke quietly, rarely raising his voice, carefully building each argument one step at a time. Yet those who listened closely recognized the remarkable strength hidden beneath his calm manner. He did not rely upon theatrical language. He relied upon logic, evidence, and patient explanation. The debates lasted for weeks. Every article of the Constitution faced close examination. Delegates questioned the powers granted to Congress, the authority of the executive branch, and the absence of an explicit list of individual rights. Madison answered each concern with remarkable composure. He acknowledged that no human document could achieve perfection. Yet he argued that rejecting the Constitution would leave the nation trapped beneath a government already proving incapable of solving its most urgent problems. One criticism troubled many citizens more than any other. The Constitution contained no Bill of Rights, guaranteeing essential liberties such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and protection against government abuse. Many opponents insisted they could not support the new framework without these explicit protections. Initially, Madison believed the Constitution itself limited federal authority sufficiently. However, he also recognized that public confidence mattered as much as legal theory. If additional guarantees could strengthen trust without weakening the government, they deserved serious consideration. This willingness to reconsider his own position revealed an important quality of his leadership. Madison did not confuse consistency with stubbornness. When evidence suggested that compromise would strengthen rather than endanger the Republic, he accepted it. Preserving the Union required flexibility, guided by principle, not rigid attachment to personal pride. This ability to adapt without abandoning his core convictions distinguished him from many political figures whose greatest loyalty remained directed toward their own opinions. At last, after weeks of intense debate, Virginia voted to ratify the Constitution by a narrow margin. The decision marked one of the most important victories of Madison's career. Shortly afterward, other key states followed. The Constitution gradually gained the support required to become the supreme law of the United States. The fragile experiment conceived during the hot summer in Philadelphia had survived its first great public test. For a brief moment, Americans allowed themselves to hope that the long years of uncertainty were finally ending. Yet Madison understood that written words alone could never preserve freedom. Constitutions required faithful leaders, engaged citizens, and a continuing willingness to improve institutions. As new challenges emerged, the document established a framework, not a guarantee. Every generation would inherit the responsibility of protecting the balance between liberty and authority that the founders had struggled so carefully to create. Soon, another challenge awaited him. George Washington would become the nation's first president, and the new government would begin operating under the Constitution for the very first time. Every decision, every appointment, and every law would establish precedents that future generations might follow for centuries. James Madison, whose ideas had helped shape the Republic on paper, now faced an equally demanding task. He would have to help transform those carefully written principles into a living government, capable of proving to the world that constitutional liberty was not merely an inspiring dream, but a practical reality. When George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States, the Constitution finally moved from parchment into reality. The debates had ended, the signatures had dried, and the hopes of an entire nation now rested upon whether this new government could actually function. There were no precedents to follow, no earlier American presidents whose decisions could serve as examples. Every action taken by Washington and the men surrounding him would establish traditions that future generations might continue for centuries. Among those closest to the new president stood James Madison, whose quiet influence had already shaped the Constitution itself and would now help shape the government built upon it. Washington trusted Madison's judgment because he understood the depth of his preparation. Throughout the Constitutional Convention, Madison had demonstrated not only remarkable intelligence, but also an uncommon ability to separate temporary political passions from lasting constitutional principles. While others often focused upon immediate victories, Madison consistently thought years and even generations ahead. Washington valued that perspective. The survival of the Republic depended not merely upon solving today's problems, but upon creating institutions capable of surviving tomorrow's uncertainties. Although the Constitution had been ratified, many Americans still viewed the new government with caution. Critics watched every decision carefully, searching for signs that federal authority might gradually expand beyond its intended limits. Supporters, meanwhile, hoped the government would finally provide the stability that had been missing under the Articles of Confederation. Every appointment, every law, and every public statement carried unusual significance because the nation was discovering, one step at a time, what constitutional government would actually look like in practice. Madison quickly became one of Washington's closest advisors inside the new Congress. Officially, he served as a representative from Virginia, but his influence reached far beyond the boundaries of his own state. Fellow legislators recognized that few people understood the intentions behind the Constitution better than the man who had devoted years to studying and defending it. Whenever difficult constitutional questions arose, members frequently turned toward Madison, not because he demanded authority, but because he had earned credibility through preparation, patience, and intellectual honesty. One issue demanded attention almost immediately. During the debates over ratification, many states had agreed to support the Constitution only after receiving assurances that amendments protecting individual liberties would soon be considered. Although Madison had originally questioned whether such amendments were necessary, he never ignored the promises made during those difficult negotiations. He understood that trust formed the foundation of Republican government. If citizens believed their leaders abandoned commitments once power had been secured, confidence in the new system would quickly disappear. True leadership, Madison believed, required honoring both the written law and the unwritten expectations upon which public faith depended. Therefore, despite his earlier reservations, he carefully began drafting a series of constitutional amendments designed to protect essential individual freedoms. Rather than viewing this effort as an admission of failure, he regarded it as an opportunity to strengthen the Constitution by addressing reasonable public concerns once again. His willingness to reconsider his own position demonstrated that principle mattered more to him than personal pride. Drawing upon proposals submitted by several state conventions, Madison carefully organized and refined the amendments. His goal was not to overwhelm the Constitution with unnecessary language, but to protect those rights that formed the heart of a free society: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right of peaceful assembly, protection against unreasonable searches, guarantees of fair legal proceedings. Each safeguard reflected lessons learned from centuries of political history, as well as the recent experience of colonial resistance against arbitrary authority. The debate surrounding these amendments proved less divisive than many had expected. Although disagreements remained regarding wording and scope, broad support gradually emerged for protecting fundamental liberties. After careful revision, 12 proposed amendments were sent to the states for consideration. 10 of them would eventually be ratified and become known throughout history as the Bill of Rights. For Madison, this achievement carried profound personal meaning. Years earlier, he had visited imprisoned Baptist ministers in Virginia, whose only offense had been preaching according to their conscience. Those memories had remained with him ever since. Now, through the First Amendment, the Constitution would formally protect religious liberty while preventing the national government from establishing an official religion. What had once existed only as a deeply held conviction inside a thoughtful young student had become one of the defining principles of the American Republic. Yet even as the Bill of Rights strengthened public confidence, new disagreements began emerging within Washington's own administration. Alexander Hamilton, serving as Secretary of the Treasury, introduced an ambitious financial program designed to stabilize the nation's economy. He proposed that the federal government assume the revolutionary debts accumulated by the states, establish a national bank, strengthen public credit, and encourage economic development through a more active central government. Many of Hamilton's ideas impressed Washington. Madison, however, viewed several proposals with growing concern. The disagreement between the two men did not arise from personal hostility. They respected one another's intelligence and shared a commitment to preserving the Republic, yet they interpreted the Constitution differently. Hamilton believed the federal government possessed broad implied powers whenever those powers helped fulfill constitutional responsibilities. Madison argued that authority should remain closely tied to powers specifically granted by the Constitution itself. Expanding federal authority too far, he feared, might eventually weaken the balance so carefully constructed in Philadelphia. These debates marked the beginning of one of the most important political divisions in American history. For the first time, organized groups began forming around competing constitutional philosophies. Supporters of Hamilton favored stronger national institutions and closer cooperation between government and commerce. Those who agreed with Madison emphasized limited federal authority, agricultural independence, and careful protection of state powers. Although formal political parties had not been anticipated by the Constitution, differing interpretations naturally encouraged citizens to organize around shared ideas. Madison found this development both inevitable and troubling. He had spent years warning about factions. Now he watched new political factions emerging before his own eyes. Yet, unlike the destructive factions he had feared, these groups competed through constitutional debate rather than violence. Elections, legislative discussions, and public argument replaced armed conflict. While disagreement sometimes became intense, the constitutional framework provided peaceful methods for resolving disputes. In many ways, the system Madison had helped design was already proving capable of managing the very political competition he had predicted. Washington often found himself standing between these competing visions. He valued Hamilton's financial expertise. He trusted Madison's constitutional judgment. More than anything, he feared excessive political division might weaken the fragile Union. Throughout his presidency, he repeatedly urged Americans to remember that loyalty to the nation must remain stronger than loyalty to any political faction. Madison respected Washington deeply. Even when he disagreed with particular policies supported by the administration, these years taught Madison another enduring lesson. Writing constitutional principles was only the beginning. Applying them to real problems demanded constant wisdom, humility, and restraint. Every generation would interpret the Constitution through new circumstances that its framers could never fully anticipate. No document, however carefully written, could replace thoughtful public leadership. Institutions created opportunities for liberty, but citizens themselves remained responsible for preserving it. As the new republic gained confidence, foreign governments watched with cautious curiosity. Many European observers doubted that a large republic governed by elected representatives could survive for long. History seemed to support their skepticism. Previous republics had often collapsed into dictatorship, civil war, or political chaos. America remained an experiment, whose final outcome no one could confidently predict. James Madison understood those doubts better than almost anyone. After all, he had spent much of his adult life studying exactly why republics failed. Now, he found himself living inside history's greatest constitutional experiment. Whether it succeeded or collapsed would depend not upon lofty ideals alone, but upon countless ordinary decisions made by imperfect human beings. The scholar who had once searched ancient books for lessons about liberty was now helping write a new chapter that future generations around the world would study in those same books, searching for answers to the timeless question of whether freedom and stable government could truly exist together. As the first years of the new republic unfolded, James Madison found himself living through a reality unlike anything he had imagined while studying ancient governments in the quiet rooms of Princeton or later at Montpelier. The Constitution now existed not as a theory, but as a living framework, tested each day by ordinary political disagreements, unexpected crises, and the imperfect decisions of imperfect people. Every vote in Congress, every executive action, and every judicial interpretation added another layer to an experiment that much of the world still believed would eventually fail. Despite his enormous influence in creating the Constitution, Madison never considered the document complete or beyond improvement. Unlike many political leaders who defended every previous decision simply to protect their own reputation, he believed that constitutional government required constant reflection. The founders had not written a sacred text incapable of adaptation. They had established a structure strong enough to endure, while allowing future generations to improve it when experience revealed weaknesses. This humility separated Madison from many statesmen who confused personal pride with political principle. His relationship with Thomas Jefferson grew even stronger during these years. Although Jefferson had been serving as the American minister to France while the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, he returned home deeply interested in the nation's political future. The two Virginians shared many convictions about Republican government, individual liberty, religious freedom, and the importance of limiting concentrated power. Together, they began shaping an alternative political vision that differed increasingly from the financial and constitutional philosophy promoted by Alexander Hamilton. The disagreements between Madison and Hamilton became more pronounced with each passing year. Both men sincerely believed they were acting in the nation's best interest. Yet they viewed the Constitution through different lenses. Hamilton believed that the federal government should possess broad flexibility to address national problems. Even when specific powers were not explicitly listed in the Constitution, Madison worried that such interpretations, however well-intentioned, might gradually expand federal authority beyond the limits carefully negotiated during the convention. Their debates rarely lacked intellectual depth. Each man supported his arguments with history, legal reasoning, and constitutional interpretation. Neither relied solely upon personal attacks, yet beneath the respectful exchange of ideas stood two competing visions of America's future. Would the Republic grow stronger through energetic national institutions capable of guiding economic development, or would its greatest strength come from preserving local self-government, agricultural independence, and carefully limited federal authority? Ordinary citizens increasingly found themselves choosing between these competing perspectives. Newspapers published passionate editorials. Public meetings attracted growing crowds. Political discussion became part of daily life in towns, farms, workshops, and taverns throughout the country. Although the Constitution had not anticipated organized political parties, differences in philosophy naturally encouraged people to unite behind leaders whose ideas reflected their own hopes and concerns. Madison observed this development with mixed emotions. Years earlier, he had warned about the dangers of factions, believing they could threaten Republican government if allowed to dominate public life. Now, political organizations were becoming unavoidable. At first, this seemed like a contradiction. However, Madison gradually recognized an important distinction. Factions became dangerous, not simply because people disagreed, but because they abandoned constitutional methods for resolving disagreement. If competing groups accepted elections, respected the law, and recognized the legitimacy of peaceful opposition, political competition could actually strengthen rather than destroy Republican government. This realization reflected the maturity of his political thought. He had never believed that disagreement itself represented failure. Healthy republics required debate. They required criticism. They required citizens willing to question those who exercised authority. The true danger appeared only when ambition overwhelmed constitutional restraint, or when victory became more important than preserving the institutions that allowed peaceful disagreement to continue. During Washington's second presidential term, international events placed additional strain upon the young republic. Revolutionary France, inspired in part by America's own struggle for independence, entered a period of dramatic political upheaval. Many Americans celebrated the French Revolution as another triumph for liberty. Others watched with growing concern as violence spread and political instability deepened. The question soon emerged whether the United States should openly support France or remain neutral in the growing conflict between European powers. Washington favored neutrality. Madison respected the president's desire to protect the fragile republic from foreign entanglements. Yet, debates over foreign policy further intensified domestic political divisions. Every international crisis seemed to produce another constitutional question. Who possessed authority to shape foreign policy? How should treaties be interpreted? What responsibilities accompanied neutrality? Once again, the new government found itself creating precedents that future generations would inherit. Throughout these controversies, Madison never abandoned his habit of careful preparation. While others often responded immediately to dramatic events, he continued reading widely, studying history, examining legal arguments, and reflecting before reaching conclusions. Colleagues sometimes joked that no one prepared more thoroughly than James Madison. Behind the gentle humor lay genuine admiration. They knew his opinions emerged not from passing emotion, but from patient investigation. His personal life remained remarkably simple, despite his growing national prominence. He never cultivated the image of a political celebrity. He rarely sought applause. He preferred thoughtful conversation to public spectacle. Visitors frequently remarked upon his modest appearance and quiet manner, often expressing surprise that such an unassuming man possessed one of the sharpest political minds in America. Madison seemed almost indifferent to fame itself. What mattered to him was not whether history remembered his name, but whether the constitutional system he had helped build proved capable of preserving liberty for generations yet unborn. This attitude shaped the way he approached public service. He viewed political office not as personal achievement, but as temporary responsibility. Leaders entered government. They performed their duty. Then they returned authority to the people through elections and constitutional processes. Such peaceful transfers of power distinguished republics from monarchies, where leadership often depended upon inheritance, force, or permanent privilege. The success of these constitutional traditions mattered deeply to Madison, because they demonstrated that free government could remain orderly without relying upon coercion. As Washington's presidency neared its conclusion, another unprecedented challenge approached. The nation would soon witness its first peaceful transfer of executive power. Under the Constitution, many European observers doubted that such a transition could occur without violence or political collapse. Throughout history, changes in national leadership had frequently produced civil conflict, military intervention, or struggles for absolute power. America now faced an opportunity to prove that constitutional government offered another path. Madison recognized the significance immediately. If the Republic survived this transition peacefully, confidence in constitutional institutions would grow enormously. If it failed, critics around the world would claim that Republican government remained little more than an attractive fantasy, incapable of surviving ordinary political change. The experiment that had begun in Philadelphia continued entering new stages, each more demanding than the last. Yet through every challenge, James Madison remained remarkably consistent. He trusted laws more than personalities. He trusted institutions more than temporary popularity. Above all, he trusted that carefully balanced constitutional government, though never perfect, offered humanity its best hope for protecting both liberty and order. He could not know that even greater responsibilities still awaited him. Before many years had passed, he would become Secretary of State. Later, the fourth President of the United States, and eventually guide the nation through another war that would test the Constitution under conditions its framers had scarcely imagined. The quiet scholar, who had once feared his fragile health might prevent him from serving his country, had already transformed the political destiny of America. Yet history still held some of its greatest challenges in reserve, waiting for the moment when James Madison himself would be called upon not merely to defend the Republic with words, but to preserve it through leadership in one of its darkest hours. When James Madison eventually looked back upon the long road that had carried him from the quiet fields of Montpelier to the center of American history, he could never have claimed that the journey had been guided by certainty. There had been moments of confidence, but there had also been years filled with doubt, disagreement, and difficult choices. Every major achievement had required compromise. Every constitutional principle had been tested by human ambition. Every victory had revealed another challenge, waiting just beyond the horizon. Yet through all those years, one belief remained remarkably constant. Liberty could survive only when supported by institutions strong enough to protect it and citizens wise enough to preserve it. History would later remember Madison as the father of the Constitution, but no title could fully capture the complexity of his contribution. He had not built the American Republic alone, nor had he ever claimed to do so. George Washington provided leadership that inspired public confidence. Alexander Hamilton offered extraordinary financial vision. Thomas Jefferson articulated the ideals of liberty with unforgettable eloquence. Countless delegates, legislators, judges, soldiers, and ordinary citizens shaped the nation's future through sacrifices both great and small. Madison understood that republics were never the work of a single remarkable individual. They were sustained by generations willing to place the common good above temporary personal advantage. Perhaps his greatest strength was not brilliance alone, but humility. Unlike many political leaders whose confidence hardened into certainty, Madison remained willing to reconsider his own conclusions when experience demanded it. He had originally questioned the necessity of a Bill of Rights, yet he later became its principal architect. He accepted compromise during the Constitutional Convention, not because he lacked conviction, but because he understood that preserving the Union required balancing competing truths rather than insisting upon absolute ideological victory. This ability to adapt without abandoning principle became one of the defining characteristics of his public life. The Constitution itself reflected that same philosophy. It assumed neither perfect leaders nor perfect citizens. Instead, it acknowledged the complicated reality of human nature. People possessed ambition, generosity, fear, wisdom, selfishness, courage, and prejudice, often all at the same time. Rather than hoping these qualities would somehow disappear, the constitutional system attempted to prevent any single weakness from overwhelming the entire republic. Separated powers, checks and balances, regular elections, and judicial independence all grew from Madison's conviction that good government depended less upon trusting individuals than upon designing institutions capable of limiting human error. Over the centuries that followed, America would experience challenges far beyond anything imagined. During the summer of 1787, civil war would threaten the Union itself. Economic depressions would test public confidence. World wars would demand extraordinary national sacrifice. Movements for civil rights would expose contradictions that had existed since the nation's founding. Each generation would interpret the Constitution through circumstances its framers could never have fully anticipated. Some would praise Madison's vision, others would criticize its limitations. Yet the remarkable durability of the constitutional framework testified to the depth of thought invested in its creation. Even today, many of the political questions debated throughout modern democracies echo the same concerns that occupied Madison's mind more than 2 centuries ago. How much authority should government possess? How should individual liberty be protected? What limits should restrain political power? How can competing interests coexist peacefully inside one nation? These questions have never disappeared because they arise from permanent features of human society rather than temporary political disagreements. Madison understood that every free generation would need to answer them again. His personal example offers another lesson, equally important. In an age when public recognition often attracts more attention than quiet service, Madison demonstrated that lasting influence does not always belong to the loudest voice. He was neither the tallest statesman nor the most charismatic speaker. Crowds rarely gathered simply to hear him speak. Many contemporaries described him as modest, almost to the point of shyness. Yet beneath that reserved exterior lived one of the most disciplined political minds of the 18th century. A man whose careful preparation repeatedly changed the course of history without seeking applause for himself. There is something profoundly human about that contrast. The man who helped design one of history's most influential constitutions often appeared physically fragile. The thinker whose ideas reshaped governments around the world, rarely dominated conversations through force of personality. The scholar who studied the failures of ancient republics eventually helped build one that would endure far longer than many critics believed possible. His life reminds us that greatness does not always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it advances quietly, one carefully considered decision at a time. Perhaps this explains why Madison continues to fascinate historians centuries after his death. They do not merely study the offices he held or the documents he helped write. They study the habits of mind that allowed him to approach political problems with unusual patience, intellectual honesty, and respect for complexity. He resisted simple answers because he knew that governing free people rarely produced simple questions. Certainty often belonged to those who had studied the least. The wisdom belonged to those willing to examine every side before reaching judgment. In the final measure, James Madison's legacy extends beyond constitutions, amendments, or political institutions. His greatest gift may have been the example of thoughtful citizenship itself. He demonstrated that democracy depends not only upon elections, but upon informed participation, civil disagreement, and a willingness to place constitutional principles above temporary political advantage. Freedom, he believed, could never survive through passion alone. It required discipline, education, restraint, and an enduring commitment to justice. As the years passed, and younger generations inherited the republic he had helped shape, Madison remained aware that no constitution, however carefully written, could permanently guarantee liberty. Documents could guide a nation, but only its people could preserve its character. Every generation received freedom as both an inheritance and a responsibility. Neglect it, and even the strongest institutions would weaken. Protect it with wisdom and integrity. And the experiment begun by a small gathering of delegates in Philadelphia could continue inspiring free societies for centuries to come. And so the story of James Madison is not merely the story of a founding father or a constitutional scholar. It is the story of a man who believed that ideas mattered, that preparation mattered, that character mattered, and that quiet perseverance could accomplish what force alone never could. From the peaceful hills of Virginia to the halls where a nation found its voice, his life became enduring proof that history is often shaped not only by those who command armies or captivate crowds, but also by those who patiently build the principles upon which free people choose to govern themselves. Long after his own voice had fallen silent, those principles continued speaking across generations, reminding the world that the strongest republics are built not upon power alone, but upon wisdom, balance, and the unending pursuit of liberty.